Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Baute, Chief Commercial Officer at POLITICO, and we're pleased to have you joining us today for a timely conversation about one of the most closely watched topics in Washington and across every critical industry, which is artificial intelligence. AI is advancing at an extraordinary pace, reshaping economies, national security, and the way organizations the world over operate. But policymakers are grappling with how to strike the right balance between encouraging innovation and addressing the risks that come with transformative technologies. To help us explore these issues, I'm joined today by Drew Bagley, Chief Privacy Officer at CrowdStrike. And Drew leads CrowdStrike's global work on cybersecurity, privacy policy, bringing deep expertise at the intersection of technology, law, and public policy. Drew, great to see you again, and thanks so much for joining us.
Great to see you, too. Thanks for having me.
Let's dive right in here. Artificial intelligence is transforming industries in real time. Cybersecurity is no exception. So as threats become more sophisticated, what role can AI play in strengthening cyber resilience?
Sure, Callie. When I think about AI and cybersecurity, I like to break it down into three buckets. So there's AI for defense, AI for offense, and then protecting the AI itself. When it comes to AI for defense, AI has actually been part of cybersecurity for a very long time. And traditionally, when we think about the value that AI brings to cybersecurity, you have to remember that fundamentally, cybersecurity is a data problem. There's lots of data generated by our devices, by the way in which machines talk to machines. Users interact with machines all the time. And the key is really to derive signal from noise to figure out what's anomalous and what behavior that's anomalous is actually malicious versus what's benign, that's going on all the time. And over time, as devices get more complex, as the ways in which we all as users interact with devices becomes more and more complex, there's a lot more data. And also, over time, as adversary activity evolves, that means that looking and trying to figure out what's anomalous becomes much more challenging. So today, for example, the overwhelming majority of intrusions don't involve any malware. They just involve the use of legitimate credentials that adversaries are able to obtain, and then adversaries are logging in instead of breaking into devices. And what that means, and where that value proposition comes for AI, is that when you're processing that much data, and it becomes that much more difficult to tell what's legitimate and what's not legitimate, that's where AI is very, very useful. So a lot of that traditionally has been done with machine learning, static machine learning, behavioral machine learning, to look for indicators of attack. And increasingly, we're in a world in which it's not just how AI is used to detect things, but also AI being leveraged by defenders to even interact with this data. And that's what's really the next leap forward now, to become much more efficient, because adversaries are really, really fast, and defenders have to be faster. And so it's only really through AI and operating at that AI speed that you're able to do that, because AI brings speed and scale.
So defenders are moving faster. They understand the complexity of the threats is growing and increasing. But how are adversaries actually using AI right now?
Yeah, adversaries, like all of us, are leveraging AI. And so the ways in which I think about that in the adversary space is really, at a high level, AI has democratized lots of things. There are many things we all do that used to require either resources, time, maybe even knowledge in many ways, that no longer require that. Maybe all three, and that no longer require that. And that the same is going on for adversaries, where already in cybersecurity, adversaries can go and buy credentials on the dark web, can use ransomware as a service without actually having to know how to code, or malware as a service. And so there is this overwhelming trend of a democratization of destruction. And now with AI, adversaries are really using it for several categories. So one is to better increase social engineering. So adversaries can set up fake personas online much easier. With the North Korean IT workers, for example, AI was used to generate LinkedIn profiles and CVs that were much more compelling than if somebody was just acting on their own. But because they're able to use that generative AI, they're able to do that. Similarly, just creating personas that then trick people into turning over credentials, pretending to be the IT help desk, crafting better phishing emails, better lures that seem more compelling than the ones of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And then on a technical standpoint, it's much easier now with even already breached data to sift through that data by leveraging AI. and determine, again, that signal from noise problem to solve, determine what is actually useful in that data set versus what's not, or to look at even technical memory dumps from computers and figure out where there might be passwords, or look for vulnerabilities. A lot of that would have taken a lot more time and a lot more resources in the past, and that's really something where the barrier of entry is lowered a lot with AI and the way adversaries are using it. And then lastly, in addition to the social engineering and the technical operations, there's a lot of disinformation that adversaries are able to use. So we can think of disinformation obviously in a geopolitical sense, but disinformation also in terms of just even fraud. Adversaries are much better able to set up websites that look like legitimate brands and are actually trying, once again, like the tale as old as time, to just trick people into turning over their legitimate information. And that's become a lot easier with AI.
So you mentioned earlier about generative AI, which is something that I think most folks are really familiar with. But let's talk for a second about agentic AI, known for its autonomous decision-making capabilities, that's been generating a lot of buzz recently. For those who may be less familiar, can you explain how this could influence the way that we think about cybersecurity going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about agentic AI is moving us from our interaction with AI today generally being ask and answer, where you ask a question to an LLM and we get some sort of answer that may or may not be right sometimes. And then we're moving to this really ask and act. So we're asking for something to be done and then actions are being taken, because agentic AI is goal-oriented. And then there's a series of tasks that are predefined that are carried out by the agentic AI. And this is something that's revolutionary in so many realms and so many industries where I don't think we really know the full potential yet. But in cybersecurity in particular, we're already seeing this operationalized and having tremendous effect. So when we think about agentic AI in cybersecurity, one of the primary use cases is really for prioritization. So if you're a defender and you're dealing with a lot of potential alerts, any of those could be an actual intrusion, they could be false positives, they could be alerts, but they might not be the top priority to get to. It might be that there's more important alerts. So for figuring out that prioritization, that's where agentic AI is able to really look at the data and then create a sort of list of priorities for the defender to go after. But then secondly, agentic AI also is able to be used to actually take action. So traditionally, even when there is good information, there's an alert, and a defender knows that maybe there could be an adversary on a network, and maybe they need to change credentials to get them off. Maybe there's some sort of malware they need to delete, or maybe there's some sort of vulnerabilities they need to patch. That's something where then it's up to the defender to kick off that process, figure out when to do it, and do that at scale. And now that's where agentic AI can actually propose a list of actions, have the human sign off on it, and then take those actions.
So like with any new technology, there are debates among policymakers about how to best regulate AI. When it comes to new laws and regulations for AI and cybersecurity, how do you think policymakers can strike the right balance between encouraging innovation and managing potential risks too?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to start with the right lens and remember that AI is a technology like any other in some ways. It allows you to do things at speed and at scale, but it's still a technology. It's not an end state. And so regulating AI for the sake of AI is rarely going to be the best approach. Instead, it's really important to be very tailored and think about the harms that, or the risks that policymakers are actually trying to protect against, and figure out, is that really because AI is being used, or is AI just potentially allowing something that already was illegal to be done at speed and scale, or is there something novel about AI actually being in place? So if you break down AI to its components, you really have the data, the identities, and the credentials interacting with the data, and then the systems powering the AI, and there's a lot of hardware hosting all of that and everything. And so one of the things to think about then is, with each of those components, what is it that maybe needs to be regulated or doesn't need to be regulated? And so if you take, for example, data, we can think about privacy. We're going to care about privacy whether our data is in an AI system or whether it's in a database. And similarly, in terms of how we regulate it, it might not be novel, just the fact that AI is being used. It might be that we still care about certain types of data, and then there's other types of data that's less sensitive, and other types of data that's public and not sensitive at all. And so I think really what's more effective is to think about it that way, right? If we're regulating privacy, then are our privacy laws sufficient for AI? If we're regulating something else that is, deals more with outcomes, is that sufficient or not, rather than just focusing on the AI itself? And fundamentally, I think really in the regulatory environment, it's really important to actually be incentivizing the adoption of AI, the adoption of automating tasks, of doing things more efficiently and more accurately. So it has to be good AI, trustworthy AI, and that's where a lot of the guidance actually should be focused on, is making sure the AI is trustworthy and then also secure.
The White House recently released its AI action plan, calling for rapid AI innovation and adoption across critical industries, including cybersecurity. So what steps can policymakers take to better support the adoption of AI-powered security tools across government agencies and key infrastructure sectors?
Yeah, the action plan was a fantastic step forward, because with the action plan from the White House, there really is this push to incentivize the adoption of AI. But importantly, throughout the action plan, several times, security is mentioned. Security is a huge part of what's in the action plan, not just AI for security, but also securing the AI itself. And I think that's fundamentally important, because AI is going to increasingly disappear into our tech stack, where we're not going to think about it in the same way we don't really think about the components of the internet. And it's important to really make sure that we're thinking about the security of the AI as part of that. But also the action plan calls out securing critical infrastructure. And then the critical infrastructure that increasingly will actually be critical infrastructure that the AI is hosted on. So we can think about the data centers, we can think about the power plants, and then all the different ways we as users are interacting with AI today, but increasingly all the different ways in which other AI is going to be interacting with other AI. So security is a huge part of it. So I think in terms of steps as part of that action plan, it really is roll out adoption and really set an example by doing it right, by making sure that secure AI is being rolled out, by making sure that from a procurement standpoint, the right technologies are being purchased to secure that AI. I think that's fundamentally important.
A quick follow-up, what can the private sector do to support this innovation in this process?
Yeah, I think that's twofold. So I think first of all, there's innovators in this space. Cybersecurity innovators must continue to innovate by focusing on what the adversary is doing, not merely what feature sounds good like it will sell, but really keeping up in that pace with what adversaries are doing, so that that innovation is really driven in a real way to protect against threats. And then secondly, I think in the private sector, for large organizations that might not be the innovators of cybersecurity technology, to actually be adopting cybersecurity best practices, leveraging technology in a way that really serves as a model, that is going to be influential. That's influential today already. The ways in which Fortune 500 companies, and especially if you look at certain sectors like the financial sector, are able to have really, really strong cybersecurity programs, that's something that then can serve as a model, not only in the public sector, but also in entities that are dependent upon the public sector, like critical infrastructure entities.
So the last panel just before us closed with a question on what is the worst possible scenarios or outcomes that could happen. So as we wrap up, let's take a little bit of a different approach. Let's look ahead.
We're not doing doom and gloom?
Not unless you want to. Choose your own adventure here. But what I'm most curious...
I have a fork in the road, okay.
What I'm most curious to hear, Drew, is what do you think policymakers and industry leaders need to do to prioritize to make sure that the U.S. stays ahead of some of those doomsday threats that we just heard about?
Well, staying ahead is key. That absolutely has to be the goal. And so I think that big picture, when we think about the adoption of AI, we have to think about all of the different, there were the components I was talking about a moment ago, where there's the data, how are we protecting the data, how are we protecting the systems, and how are we protecting the identities interacting with those. I think that's fundamentally important. But then big picture, those other components, how are we thinking about and staying ahead of generating enough power for AI in a sustainable way and in a way where that's secure, those facilities are secure. The data centers themselves, how are we doing that and thinking about that in a sustainable way that's also very secure. And then also with data, there are such large amounts of data. I think it's really important in terms of staying ahead to really think about things through a risk lens. You either have visibility into a risk and can mitigate it, or if you don't have visibility, you're not going to be able to mitigate that. And so we need to constantly be asking ourselves, do we have visibility into the risk? What are the risks? And think about what threat actors are doing and constantly, in a continuous way, evaluate what that risk is. And then constantly ask, do we have the data to actually see what that risk is? And if we have those things, then that's where we can always, in terms of the staying ahead part, be thinking about how to leverage that data to mitigate that risk and close that risk. The risk will always be there. The risk will always be evolving, but we have to be really thinking about that. And then really, now that we're in this world where I think folks are better able to understand there are physical components to all of the cyber stuff. It's not just ones and zeros. It's ones and zeros that sit somewhere, that are powered somehow. I think it's important to think about that from an infrastructure way and make sure we're making those sorts of investments. And that really means policymakers need to ask, how are we securing it? What is the risk? Do we have visibility into the risk? How are we securing it? But also, how are we resourcing all of this? And are we resourcing all of this? Because you could do all of those other things right, and then that gives you maybe an approach, a plan, and whatnot. But if it's not being resourced in some sort of way, then you might not be effective in actually carrying it out and ensuring that things are secure and implementing it. And I think that's really important. So I think policymakers today need to ask that big question of how are we making sure that we're incentivizing secure AI and resourcing that secure AI? I think that's the big takeaway.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Drew, thank you so much for the discussion, for sharing your perspectives, and thank you to CrowdStrike for their support of today's event.
Thank you for having me, and I hope we were a good warm-up act for Director Karen Cross. If he's
I hope
popular,
so too.
It's because of us.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Drew.
Thank you.
Great.